So picture this. Solomon, one of the wisest men ever, finally finishes building the temple for the Lord. Sounds like a triumph, right? But here's the thing, beneath all that glory, little compromises start creeping in and things aren't quite as perfect as they seem. In today's story, we're diving into the highs, the missteps, and the lessons hidden in Solomon's journey. Lessons that still hit home for us today. Stick around, because some of these twists are really eye-opening. Alright, so let's jump in. Imagine Solomon standing there after years, like literally years, of construction. He's finally finished the temple. The big house for the Lord. You know, the one he was called to build. And he's done it, every detail meticulously placed, the stones in line, the cedar panels gleaming, the bronze altar polished. And then he offers sacrifices, not just a little, oh no, burnt offerings and peace offerings. He's right there on the altar, incense burning, smoke curling up into the sky, and he's praying a dedication prayer that's meant to consecrate this entire place for God. He's kneeling, hands raised, heart poured out, and you can almost hear the quiet awe of everyone gathered around. Now, this is Solomon at his most obedient. He's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. The temple is finished, the dedication is perfect, and he's following God's instructions. But, and here's the subtle part, there's a tiny, almost invisible crack starting to form in his heart. It's not blatant, not yet, but it's there. He's stepping into a role that technically isn't his. I mean, he's the king, not a priest, but he's offering these sacrifices himself. And wait, that's kind of a big deal, because that's crossing a line, even if it seems innocent on the surface. But he doesn't even see it as compromise yet. He's proud, maybe just a little too proud of being able to handle both roles. He's obedient, yes, but the seeds of those little compromises, those subtle things that slowly chip away at spiritual integrity, are beginning to take root. And it's fascinating because this moment is so layered. On the one hand, you have the completion of God's temple, a monumental achievement in human history, literally a place where the presence of God would dwell. On the other hand, you have Solomon, human as ever, starting to stretch his own authority just a bit too far, testing boundaries in ways that might seem harmless but are actually significant. You can almost feel the tension there. He's obedient, he's faithful, he's brilliant, but he's starting to weave in these little personal touches that hint at a bigger story unfolding. And isn't that kind of like life for us? Sometimes we don't see the cracks forming until they've already started to shape the bigger picture. So, Solomon finishes his prayer, standing up after kneeling with hands lifted high. He blesses the assembly, every man, woman, and child present. And here's where it gets really interesting. He says, "Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel." Pause for a second. Wait, what does that really mean? The ultimate rest, the peace that Solomon is talking about, isn't coming from human effort, from the temple bricks, from the sacrifices. It's coming from the Lord, and he's pointing it out right there in front of everyone. It's like he's both giving a shout out to God for his faithfulness and, maybe unknowingly, giving a glimpse of his own reliance on human structure and action as well. And you can picture it, hands still raised, voice echoing, the crowd listening intently, the smoke of the incense floating in the sunlight. Solomon reminds them that God is faithful. He talks about rest, about peace, about God never failing to keep his promises. And it's powerful. I mean, who wouldn't be inspired standing there, seeing the temple, feeling the presence of God, hearing these words? But the story isn't just about the glory of that moment. It's also about the small human tendencies that start creeping in even when everything looks perfect. And here's where we start to see the first hints of the cracks in Solomon's heart. He's doing exactly what he's called to do, yes, but the way he steps into priestly roles, the way he seems to take on responsibilities that aren't technically his, it's subtle, almost invisible, but it's there. Little compromises that, at the time, might feel harmless, but which foreshadow bigger challenges ahead. And then, as he continues, Solomon prays for the people, reminding them that God is always present, that he's faithful to forgive, and that he has a heart for all nations. It's this incredible mix of humility and authority. He's a king, he's powerful, yet he's acknowledging something far greater than himself. And the beauty of this is that you can almost feel the rhythm of the story, like watching a masterful scene unfold. Obedience, faithfulness, dedication, and just underneath it all, the gentle, almost imperceptible cracks beginning to form. You see, this is one of the reasons this passage is so compelling. It's not just history, it's human psychology, it's spiritual truth, it's a reminder of how even the wisest among us are susceptible to compromise when pride or overconfidence starts to creep in. And here's where we need to pause and really absorb it. Solomon's prayer doesn't just cover the temple. He's praying for the people, for their prosperity, for their loyalty to God. He's showing leadership that's more than just administrative. It's spiritual, relational. He's leading not only in construction, but in faith, in example. And you can see how extraordinary that is. But again, if you lean in close to the text, you start to notice the tension. He's doing the right things, following God's instructions, yet he's slipping ever so slightly into areas that weren't meant for him. That's the fascinating duality of Solomon in this moment. Faithful, yes, but hinting at the compromises that will challenge him later. And honestly, isn't that something we can relate to? We do the right things, we check the boxes, we even excel in some areas, and yet little compromises, small decisions that seem harmless, begin to shape our trajectory in ways we don't immediately recognize. And then Solomon turns the focus back to God's presence and God's rest. He reminds the people that the ultimate rest, the soul-level peace they seek, comes from God, not from temples, not from rituals, not even from kings or leaders. This is powerful. He even references imagery similar to Psalm 23, where God restores the soul and leads beside still waters. And again, we see that gentle tension. Solomon is in the role of a leader, a king, the orchestrator of this grand temple. Yet he's reminding everyone, and maybe even reminding himself, that God is the source of true peace. There's a little humility here, a little awe, a recognition that despite all human achievement, it is God who sustains and gives ultimate rest. As he continues blessing the people, Solomon emphasizes that God will never leave nor forsake his people, drawing on promises repeated throughout Scripture. It's like he's giving the people both assurance and instruction. Look, God is faithful, but your heart must remain loyal. He's speaking to them, and indirectly, perhaps speaking to himself. The text gives us a peek into his awareness of responsibility, his recognition of human weakness, and the need for divine guidance. And here's the thing, he's just completed this monumental project, yet the cracks we mentioned earlier, the small compromises, already have the potential to influence not just him, but the entire nation under his rule. And then, after the prayers and blessings, the sacrifices continue. He offers burnt offerings and peace offerings, a staggering number, 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. I mean, just pause. 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. That's insane, and the people feast as part of the dedication, because part of the sacrifice goes to God, but the rest is for the priests and the community. So it's a celebration, a festival, a demonstration of devotion, and yet it also highlights Solomon's central role. He's orchestrating the ritual, managing the feast, and even though it's a display of obedience and worship, it subtly reinforces his prominence. And again, just the tiniest hints of the human tendency to blur lines between roles, to enjoy authority a little more than is strictly intended. And throughout all of this, the temple stands as a testament to both God's faithfulness and human effort. Solomon's dedication, his prayer, and the sacrifices are all outwardly perfect. But as the narrative unfolds, the early hints of cracks, like stepping into priestly duties, making decisions for himself in the role of God's representative, orchestrating huge feasts with extravagant resources, are all there. They're not failures yet, they're tiny, almost invisible compromises. But they set the stage for what's coming later in Solomon's life, for the way human pride, even when mingled with genuine faithfulness, can begin to open doors that lead to more serious issues. So, in this first section, we see a complex mix: obedience, faithfulness, grandeur, dedication, spiritual leadership, and just beneath the surface, the early signs of compromise. Solomon is doing what he's called to do, but he's human, and humans are imperfect. And here's where the lesson hits close to home. Even when we're following God, even when we're accomplishing monumental things in our spiritual lives, we need to be aware of those tiny compromises that start small but can grow. Solomon's dedication prayer, his sacrifices, and his blessing of the people all show commitment and reverence. But the narrative is honest, letting us see that even in moments of obedience and triumph, subtle cracks can emerge, and that awareness, reflection, and humility are critical for long-term faithfulness. And so, as we picture Solomon in this moment, hands raised, voice echoing, smoke curling, a massive assembly of Israelites watching, listening, participating, we can feel the tension of human effort and divine presence. It's awe-inspiring, yes, but it's also a warning wrapped in triumph. That's what makes this part of Solomon's story so engaging. It's not just history, it's a mirror for human nature, for the ways little decisions can ripple outward, shaping not just one life, but the course of an entire nation. And that's why this first section is so rich. It's about dedication and obedience. Yes, but it's also about awareness, humility, and vigilance. It's about seeing the cracks before they widen, recognizing the subtle compromises before they grow, and understanding that faithfulness isn't just about grand gestures. It's about staying true even in the small, unseen moments. That's where the heart of Solomon's story really begins. Okay, so now let's really dig into the spiritual principles that Solomon is laying out in chapter 8. And honestly, it's pretty incredible how relevant this is, even thousands of years later. So, Solomon has just finished the temple, he's offered all the sacrifices, prayed his dedication prayer, and now he's teaching, guiding, and reminding the people about the heart of faith. And here's the thing, he's doing it in this very human, very relatable way, not just lecturing, but almost like he's talking right to each of us across time. One of the first things he emphasizes is rest. Yeah, rest, not just sleeping or taking a day off, but the kind of deep soul-level rest that comes from being connected to God. And he says, essentially, that this rest, this ultimate peace, doesn't come from your efforts, your temple, your sacrifices, or even your achievements. It comes from the Lord. And that imagery, oh, it's so vivid. Solomon references Psalm 23, where God is the shepherd, leading us beside still waters, restoring our souls. Imagine being a sheep, you know? Sheep are actually scared of running water. They'll only drink from still water, safe water, like a pond. And that's the point Solomon's making. The Lord creates this space of safety and peace, this place where your soul can be restored. And we need that, right? Because life isn't easy. Worries, stress, expectations, pressures, life piles on. But God, through his presence, offers a kind of rest that nothing else can provide. And Solomon doesn't just stop at talking about rest. He explains God's presence. He reminds everyone that the Lord is not confined by space or time. He's omnipresent. That's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. The temple is magnificent, yes, and God's glory fills it, but he's not limited to that building. He's everywhere. And here's the human connection. It's easy to think that our achievements, our rituals, our devotion somehow contain God, like we can corner him into our plans. But Solomon's pointing out, gently but firmly, that God's presence isn't about the temple or even our actions. It's about our relationship with him. And again, that rest, that peace, flows from acknowledging that presence. You don't have to earn it with perfection or measure it by how many sacrifices you make. God is faithful to forgive, to be present, to restore. Then there's faithfulness, which is huge in this chapter. Solomon reminds the people and us that God is faithful to his word. What he promises, he keeps, period. He doesn't forget. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't fail. And that's kind of comforting because, let's be honest, we humans are not consistent. We waver, we doubt, we mess up. And here's Solomon, after all this pomp and ceremony, pointing out that God's faithfulness isn't dependent on us getting it right every time. It's not about perfection. It's about God being faithful, always. And I love that because it shows a relational God who is not distant. Not capricious, but steady and trustworthy, like a rock in a storm. Prayer is another principle he emphasizes, and it's fascinating how Solomon connects it to humility. He talks about how God honors the prayers of the humble, the people who come with genuine hearts, not just as a ritual or formality. And here's where it gets real, because it's so relatable. Sometimes we pray and feel like our prayers bounce off the ceiling. We wonder, is anyone even listening? But Solomon reminds us that God does hear. He's attentive, and the posture of humility matters more than the volume of our words. It's about sincerity, not performance. And there's this beautiful connection between prayer, humility, and faith. When you approach God with a genuine heart, acknowledging your dependence on Him, that's when you experience His presence, His rest, His guidance. Now, there's this analogy that Jesus picks up later in the Gospels that really links back to Solomon, the yoke of oxen. He says, "Take his yoke upon you and learn from him, because his yoke is easy and his burden is light." And if you think about it, the imagery is perfect. When you're yoked with another ox, usually an experienced one, the younger, less skilled ox learns to plow the field without struggling as much. Life's like that too. When we're yoked to God, when we lean into Him, we're not striving in our own strength. The work isn't necessarily less, but it becomes bearable, manageable, purposeful. That's the rest Solomon's talking about. And again, it's not abstract, it's imagery we can see, almost touch in the daily rhythm of life, learning from the one who knows the field better than we ever could. And Solomon also points out the heart of God for all nations, not just Israel. It's easy to get tunnel vision, to think faithfulness, devotion, or blessings are limited to certain people. But the text is clear. God cares about all nations. And that's humbling because it reminds us that our relationship with God isn't exclusive or about human favoritism. It's about His character, His plan, His vision for the whole world. And the principle here is simple but profound. God's faithfulness is universal. His presence, His rest, His guidance, it's available to everyone who seeks Him. And speaking of humility and rest, Solomon talks about the importance of inclining hearts toward God, walking in His ways, keeping His commandments. Now, this is where human effort and divine grace intersect. The rest and faithfulness we've been talking about aren't a free pass to do whatever we want. There's a call to active engagement, to align our hearts with God, to live in integrity. And here's the beautiful tension. We're called to obedience, but we're not called to perfection. Remember, Solomon uses his father David as an example, not a flawless man, but someone after God's heart, who repented, who aligned his actions with integrity, who walked uprightly despite failures. And that's encouraging because it means our pursuit of God is a journey, not a one-time perfect performance. Solomon also stresses God's willingness to forgive when we confess our sins. This is crucial because it reinforces the idea that spiritual growth is ongoing. We stumble. We falter. We compromise sometimes, and God's presence, rest, and faithfulness are not taken away. Instead, they're there to draw us back, restore us, and guide us. And that's an important principle that echoes throughout the Bible. God's grace meets us where we are, always offering a path back to rest, alignment, and peace. And here's another angle that's fascinating. God's attention to prayer is not just a ritual formality, it's relational. Solomon points out that God honors the prayers of those who are humble and sincere. That's a principle that we often overlook. It's not about impressing God with your eloquence or counting the right number of words. It's about genuine connection, vulnerability, openness, and that ties back to rest and faithfulness. When we pray with a sincere heart, acknowledging our dependence, we experience God's presence, we find rest, and it's a reminder that our spiritual life isn't just about external actions or grand gestures. It's about the heart, the intent, the relationship, and then tying all of these together. Solomon reminds the people that ultimate rest is only found in the Lord. Rest, presence, Faithfulness, prayer, humility, obedience, they all converge in this one place. It's like a spiritual ecosystem. Each principle supports the others. Without prayer and humility, rest is superficial. Without faithfulness, prayer lacks trust. Without acknowledging God's presence, obedience is empty. And Solomon, in his storytelling way, makes these concepts accessible, tangible, relatable. He's not speaking in abstract theological terms. He's painting pictures with words, using analogies like the oxen, vivid imagery from nature, and human experience to bring these principles to life. And here's the subtle thing, and it's worth noting, even while laying out these spiritual truths, Solomon himself is human. He's at the height of achievement, temple built, sacrifices offered, prayers made, but as we've seen, little cracks in his own heart are forming. So while he teaches these principles, they're not just for the people, they're perhaps unintentionally reminders for himself too. He's showing the pattern of reliance on God, humility, obedience, and integrity, even as his own life foreshadows future compromises. And that tension between ideal principles and human imperfection is what makes this part of the story so relatable. We see these spiritual truths, and we see ourselves, and we can recognize how easy it is to learn them and yet still struggle to fully live them out. And so, in chapter 8, we get a masterclass in spiritual principles. Rest in the Lord, not in human achievement. Recognition of God's omnipresence. Faithfulness of God, independent of our own consistency. The power and posture of prayer. Humility in leadership and daily life. Obedience that is relational, not performative, and the assurance of God's forgiveness. All of this is woven together in a narrative that's not only historical but profoundly human, speaking to our own spiritual journey. And it's incredible how the text blends instruction with storytelling, teaching us principles while letting us observe human imperfection, creating this living, breathing lesson that feels as urgent now as it did then. So as you imagine Solomon there, speaking to the assembly, standing before God, finishing the temple, offering sacrifices, praying dedication prayers, and laying out these principles, you can almost hear the cadence of his speech, feel the weight of the moment, and recognize the humanity in it all. He's teaching, inspiring, warning, and guiding all at once. And the principles he's sharing, rest in God, God's presence, faithfulness, prayer, humility, obedience, forgiveness. They're timeless, they're practical, they're human, and they're a reminder that even in our own lives, the path to spiritual maturity isn't about grand gestures alone. It's about integrating these principles into our hearts, our choices, and our daily walk. And that's exactly what makes Solomon's chapter 8 so rich, so vivid, and so relatable. Alright, so now picture this. 20 years have passed. Solomon has built the temple. He's built his own palace. The nation is established. And life is moving along. And then, God appears to Solomon again, just like he did years ago when Solomon was a young king, barely out of his teens. But this time, Solomon is older, wiser, seasoned by experience. And God speaks with a tone that's both rewarding and cautionary. It's like a divine check-in, you know? The temple is finished, the house of the Lord is consecrated, and God is essentially saying, I see your work and I see your heart. And here's the first part. God talks about rewards. He says if Solomon walks in integrity and uprightness, following the example of his father David, who, despite his failures, sought God's heart, then he will be blessed. His kingdom will be established. His descendants will continue on the throne, and prosperity will flow. God's basically laying out a blueprint. Stay faithful, and these blessings follow. It's conditional, yes, but it's also deeply encouraging. You can almost imagine Solomon leaning in, listening carefully, maybe even jotting notes in his mind. Okay, keep integrity, follow God, and good things will come. But then comes the but, the divine pause that makes you sit up a little. God says, but if Solomon or his sons turn away, start worshiping other gods, ignoring his commandments, then there will be serious consequences. The house of the Lord, this magnificent temple that Solomon worked so hard to build, will be cast away. Israel will become a proverb, a warning among nations. People passing by will wonder, Why has this happened to their land and their temple? And the answer will be because they abandoned God. And here's the thing, it's not just about punishment, it's about cause and effect, about walking with God versus straying. The rewards are there, yes, but so are the consequences. And it's conditional in the clearest sense. Blessings for obedience, consequences for disobedience. And notice how personal this gets. God isn't just talking abstractly, he's connecting Solomon's heart, his choices, and the choices of his descendants directly to the temple, to the nation, to the legacy. It's tangible, immediate, and yet spiritual. And I love how it frames responsibility, not as fear, but as awareness. Solomon isn't being threatened in some arbitrary way. He's being invited to participate in a covenant, a relationship where his integrity and faithfulness produce real-world effects. And, let's be honest, this is powerful stuff. Here's the king of Israel, one of the wisest men alive, hearing directly from God that the way he leads, the way he keeps God's statutes, impacts generations. That's heavy. And then God emphasizes again that he's not asking for perfection. He's asking for walking in integrity, uprightness of heart, following his statutes and commandments. It's relatable, right? God knows we're human. He knows we'll fail at times. The point isn't perfection, it's posture of heart, intentional alignment, and commitment to follow. And that's the balance here. Rewards for faithfulness, yes, but framed by grace. Consequences for turning away, yes, but as a natural outcome of leaving God's path rather than arbitrary punishment. There's justice, there's mercy, and there's relationship all mixed together. Then, God highlights that his eyes and heart will be in the temple perpetually. The house Solomon built isn't just wood and stone, it's a place of presence, a symbol of divine attention and care. But the continuity of that blessing depends on alignment with God's commands. It's a living reminder, obedience brings life. Turning away brings loss, but God's presence is steady, awaiting a faithful heart. And here's the practical twist. Solomon, after hearing this, is not just the king managing affairs of state, he's the spiritual shepherd of the nation. His responsibilities aren't only about strategy, wealth, or construction. They're deeply spiritual. The temple, the city, the people, even the legacy of Israel all hinge on the choices made in integrity and uprightness. And God lays it out in a way that's clear but not punitive, like a loving teacher saying, "This is how life works. Stay close. Follow the path, and blessings will flow. Turn away, and consequences naturally follow." So, in this moment, we see a mix of affirmation and warning. God acknowledges Solomon's work, rewards obedience, outlines the blessings, but also doesn't shy away from warning about the risks of turning away. It's a reminder that faithfulness isn't automatic, it's active. It's a lived, intentional, ongoing choice. And even a wise king like Solomon must stay attentive, disciplined, and aligned with God's will to see the blessings fully realized. And that tension between reward and consequence, blessing and warning, freedom and responsibility is what makes this part of Solomon's story so compelling, relatable, and deeply instructive for all of us. Okay, let's slow down and really zoom in on this part of Solomon's story because it's both fascinating and a little cautionary. So, we've talked about the temple, the dedication, the blessings from God, the rewards, the warnings, all that. But here's where it gets subtle and human. The little compromises. They're tiny, almost invisible moves that seem harmless at first, but they start building cracks in the heart and the foundation of spiritual integrity. And Solomon, even in his wisdom, starts walking that path step by step. First, there's the issue of Solomon offering sacrifices himself. Now, on the surface, you might think, well, that's devotion, right? He's doing it for the Lord, but here's the catch. Solomon is the king, not a priest. Those roles were clearly separated, and by stepping into priestly duties, he's crossing a line. He's not acting out of malice, or rebellion, or arrogance necessarily, at least not at first. But what he's doing is asserting a kind of dual authority that he's not called to hold. And small as it might seem, offering the sacrifices himself, burning the incense, these tiny overreaches are the first cracks, you know. It's like when you're painting a wall and you put too much pressure on the brush in one spot. At first, it's just a smudge, barely noticeable, but over time, it can create a streak that becomes harder to fix. And then there's the use of forced labor from the remaining local populations, the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. God had instructed the Israelites to drive them out completely, but Solomon didn't. Instead, he kept them around for forced labor, while sparing the Israelites themselves from that role. Now, on the surface, this looks strategic. I mean, let's be honest, from a king's perspective, that you're trying to build a nation, you want your people safe, and these other groups are available for labor. But here's the subtle compromise. He's bending God's commands. The instruction was clear, but he's taking liberties. It's the little deviations, the decisions that feel logical or convenient, that start shaping character and, eventually, the nation's spiritual trajectory. And again, it's not an overt sin in the way we might imagine, but it's a quiet compromise that begins to accumulate. And as these cracks grow, you start seeing the pattern. Solomon's wealth explodes, his fleets are established, his cities are fortified, and he's navigating trade and diplomacy like a master. But there's a risk creeping in, reliance on human ingenuity, strategy, and material abundance instead of continual dependence on God. And that's the thing, these small compromises, they aren't dramatic at first, they're incremental, almost imperceptible. They seem like minor shortcuts or practical solutions, but each one chips away at spiritual discipline. The human tendency is to rationalize. Well, it's practical, it's efficient, it's necessary, and that's exactly what begins to happen with Solomon. And let's not forget the sacrifices themselves. He does this 3 times a year, which is in line with religious tradition, yes, but again, he's a king, not a priest, and by consistently performing these rituals, he's not only bending the rules, but subtly reinforcing the idea that he holds authority over God's sacred procedures. It's pride mixed with devotion, a kind of overconfidence in his own ability to manage spiritual and political responsibilities simultaneously. And these little steps, they start to weaken the integrity that God is looking for. The cracks aren't obvious yet to the crowd or even to Solomon himself, but they're there and they set a precedent. And here's a critical reflection. Small compromises rarely look like disasters when they happen. They're tiny, practical, sometimes even well-intentioned, but their accumulation has weight. Solomon isn't offering children in the valley of Banam yet, but he's taking the first steps along a path that eventually leads there. These early choices, small deviations, start bending his heart away from the absolute reliance on God that he once had. And it's fascinating, right? Because we can see ourselves in this. How often do we allow minor ethical shortcuts, slight compromises in integrity, or little bends in principle, thinking they're harmless, only to find them later leading to bigger consequences? It's subtle, it's incremental, and it's human. And you can almost picture it like this. Solomon is building a house. Yes, a temple, a palace, a fleet, a kingdom. But the cracks in his spiritual armor are hidden in the corners, behind the walls, beneath the glimmering gold and polished wood. They start with small choices, offering sacrifices as a king, using forced labor that God had instructed against, indulging in strategic but morally gray decisions. Each one seems reasonable at the moment, even necessary. And here's the tricky part. By the time the big moral failings emerge, the cracks have already weakened the structure, making the collapse almost inevitable. That's the human side of Solomon's story. And it's reflective, because it shows us how vulnerability to compromise isn't about a lack of intelligence or capability. Solomon is wise, strategic, and obedient in many ways, but the little, seemingly insignificant compromises, those are the ones that erode integrity over time. They start subtle with a little pride, a little convenience, a little bending of rules, a little stepping beyond one's role. And what happens is that the spirit over time adjusts, becomes less rigid, more flexible in ways that aren't healthy. And this is exactly why even someone as wise as Solomon ends up with bigger spiritual failures later on. And when you step back and look at the pattern, it's striking. The sacrifices, the labor force, the strategic decisions, they're all part of his kingdom-building genius, but they also subtly illustrate the human tendency to overstep, rationalize, and compromise. It's almost like a slow drip wearing away at the rock. The lesson? Little compromises, tiny ethical shortcuts, bending the rules, even when seemingly innocent or well-intentioned, can pave the way for major failings. Solomon's story is a mirror. It's a cautionary tale about vigilance, self-awareness, and humility. Even in moments of success, of dedication, even when doing what God calls us to do, the little decisions matter. And so, reflecting on this, it's easy to see how Solomon's heart began to change. He's still devout, he's still intelligent, he's still accomplishing incredible things, but he's also starting to allow small cracks, little compromises to form. And those cracks, left unchecked, eventually influence the trajectory of his life and reign. It's a reminder that faithfulness isn't just about grand gestures or monumental achievements. It's about attention to the small choices, the tiny compromises, the seemingly harmless deviations that can grow into something far larger over time. That's the power of Solomon's story here. The warning, the reflection, and the human truth that even wisdom and success can't fully protect us from the subtle erosion of integrity if we aren't vigilant. Alright, so now let's talk about Solomon's fleet, his insane wealth, and the strategic cities he built, because this part of his story is equal parts genius and, well, a little alarming when you really think about it. So, Solomon wasn't just sitting in Jerusalem sipping wine while the kingdom ran itself. No, he was actively expanding his influence, literally building a navy to reach distant lands, trading for resources, and strategically fortifying key cities. And the numbers here? Mind-blowing. You're going to want to hear this. First, the fleet. Solomon builds a fleet at a port called Etzion Geber near Eloth on the Red Sea. Now, this wasn't just for show. These ships were meant to travel long distances to places like Ophir, which nobody knows exactly where it was. Some say modern Saudi Arabia, but it was rich in gold and other precious commodities. And here's where it gets wild. They brought back 420 talents of gold. Let's just pause a second. One talent back then was 75 pounds, roughly. So, if you do the math, that's over 31,000 pounds of gold. And thinking in modern terms, with gold around $2,500 an ounce today, that's roughly $1.76 billion in gold. Yeah, you read that right. Almost $2 billion worth of gold coming back from one expedition. And this is all in addition to the wealth Solomon already had from tribute and trade. Crazy, right? But here's the thing, wealth itself isn't bad. God even blessed Solomon with it. But the human tendency to rely on riches rather than God starts creeping in here. You can imagine Solomon standing on his balcony, looking at the treasure, maybe feeling a little proud of his own wisdom and planning. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with being brilliant and successful, but the danger is subtle. It's easy to start trusting in the gold, the fleets, the fortified cities, rather than in the Lord who gave the wisdom to acquire them. Speaking of fortified cities, let's dive into those. Solomon was strategic, okay? He didn't just throw up walls randomly. He established fortified cities across Israel, particularly 3 major chariot cities, Hazor in the north, Megiddo in central Israel, and Gezer in the south. Hazor was positioned to intercept potential invasions from the north along the main trade routes. Megiddo, right in the Jezreel Valley, was another key hub, able to accommodate more than 400 horses. And Gezer, near the west coast, was also fortified to control access between the coast and Jerusalem. So, from a tactical standpoint, Solomon was brilliant. He created a network of strongholds to protect his kingdom and his trade interests. And let's talk about the labor for a second, because that's where some of the subtle compromises show up again. Solomon used forced labor for these projects, which included the remaining non-Israelite populations in the land. Strategically, it was smart. His own people weren't burdened, but it was bending God's commands. These were people God had instructed Israel to drive out. By keeping them for forced labor, Solomon was making a practical choice, sure, but also stepping into moral gray areas. And again, that's a recurring theme. Wisdom and strategy mixed with human compromise. Now, back to the wealth. Beyond the gold from Ophir, Solomon received tribute from neighboring kings, exchanged cities for resources, and managed trade deals that would be impressive even by today's standards. One example is King Hiram of Tyre, who helped supply cedar and cypress wood. Solomon gave him 20 cities in Galilee in exchange for gold and materials. Hiram called them Kabul, meaning basically good for nothing. which is kind of hilarious. But here's the mind-blowing part. For what Hiram considered worthless settlements, Solomon got 120 talents of gold. That's 8,400 pounds of gold. Today, around $336 million. And Hiram, the foreign king, wasn't even related to Solomon. So Solomon was negotiating like a master, leveraging settlements, resources, and strategic partnerships to expand his kingdom's wealth. And you can almost picture the scene. Fleets returning from distant lands, ships laden with gold, silver, exotic animals, ivory, and other treasures. The cities are fortified, the roads secure, trade is booming, and Solomon is in the middle of it all, orchestrating it with incredible wisdom. It's awe-inspiring, right? But there's that human tension again. With all this wealth and power, there's a temptation to lean on it rather than God. That's subtle, but that's the danger. The story is telling us that God's blessing comes with a responsibility to remain dependent, humble, and aligned with his commands. And what's remarkable is that Solomon's vision wasn't limited to defense and wealth. He was thinking long-term about the stability of Israel. Strategic cities, trade routes, fortifications, and a powerful navy were all part of a bigger plan. He combined wisdom, foresight, and resourcefulness to create a kingdom that could thrive for generations. But as we know from the story, these same achievements set the stage for future challenges, because reliance on human strategy and riches can subtly erode reliance on God. So, there's the awe-inspiring brilliance of Solomon, a massive fleet, strategic cities, and unimaginable wealth. But here's the reflective part. Those practical decisions, while wise and effective, also show the fine line between skillful leadership and compromise. The line between trusting in God and trusting in gold, in cities, in ships, in human cleverness, is easy to cross if you're not vigilant. Solomon's story is both inspiring and cautionary. The same wisdom that builds empires can, if unchecked, open doors to human pride and dependence on worldly success. And as you picture all of this, the gold, the fleets, the fortified cities, the bustling trade, the labor force, it's awe-inspiring. You can almost feel the weight of it, the scale, the human ingenuity. But mixed into that awe is a subtle lesson. No matter how brilliant, how successful, how wealthy, the heart must remain aligned with God. That's the takeaway. Solomon's accomplishments are legendary, yes, but the story invites us to reflect on where we place our trust. Are we relying on God or on our own wealth, power, and strategy? It's a tension that's woven into the narrative, and it's a lesson we can carry with us today. Alright, so let's set the scene here. Solomon has just finished the temple. The dedication prayers are done, and now comes the grand feast. And when I say grand, I mean like mind-blowingly massive. This isn't just a small celebration. We're talking about thousands of people, animals in the tens of thousands, food, music, worship, an event that literally brings the entire kingdom together. Imagine the atmosphere, the smell of burnt offerings, the clamor of people celebrating, priests organizing the rituals, and the sheer awe of seeing this completed temple, the central place of worship for Israel, gleaming under the sun. So, first off, the sacrifices. Solomon offered 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. And I know, just pause and let that sink in. 22,000 bulls, 120,000 sheep. The scale is almost incomprehensible. And yes, part of this was a ritual sacrifice to honor God. But here's the thing, not all of it was for God alone. A large portion of these animals was distributed to the priests and to the people for feasting. It was a massive communal celebration, a combination of worship and public rejoicing. So, picture it, the smell of roasting meat, the sizzle over the fire, the laughter and chatter of thousands of people enjoying the feast. It's like a biblical version of a mega festival, and everyone is included. And the feast didn't just last a day or two, it went on for a long time. 7 days for the temple dedication, and then 7 more days connected with the Feast of Tabernacles, which was already an annual celebration in Israel. So in total, we're looking at 2 weeks of continuous festivities, culminating on the 8th day when people finally returned to their homes. That overlap is fascinating because it shows how the temple dedication wasn't just about construction or rituals, it was tied into Israel's broader spiritual rhythm. The Feast of Tabernacles, if you remember, is all about remembering God's provision during the wilderness journey, celebrating harvest, and coming together in gratitude. By linking the temple dedication to this festival, Solomon essentially anchors the temple in both national and spiritual significance, making it the centerpiece of worship and communal life. And it's easy to forget in all of this how monumental the temple was. We talk about sacrifices and feasts, but this temple represented the permanent dwelling of God's presence among his people. It wasn't just a building, it was the fulfillment of a promise, the visible symbol of God's glory resting in Israel. So for everyone present, this wasn't just a party, it was a spiritual high point, a tangible reminder that God was with them, that the long years of wandering, rebuilding, and waiting had led to this moment. And now, imagine the crowd's reactions. I mean, think about seeing that many sacrifices, that much wealth poured into celebration, thousands of people participating, priests coordinating the rituals, everyone cheering, offering praise. It's a visual and sensory overload. You'd see young and old alike, all standing in awe, some probably wiping tears away, just taking in the sheer scale of God's provision and Solomon's obedience. There's joy, gratitude, reverence, and a little bit of human amazement at the sheer size and organization of everything. And that's the thing, Solomon didn't just throw a feast, he orchestrated a national moment, one that reminded everyone of God's presence and faithfulness. And then, the way the temple functioned after this feast is significant too. Before this, Israel didn't have a permanent central place of worship. The high priest would enter the Holy of Holies only once a year to atone for the sins of the nation. But now, with the temple completed, the people had a fixed sacred space to come together regularly to offer sacrifices, worship, and experience God's presence. It was transformative, and tying it to the Feast of Tabernacles also reinforced the idea that God's provision and presence weren't occasional, they were ongoing. The temple became the spiritual heart of Israel, a place of continuity, guidance, and unity. And speaking of continuity, the dedication and feast also reinforced communal identity. You know, when the whole nation comes together, sharing in food, worship, and ritual, it's not just a religious act, it's social cohesion, cultural memory, and spiritual reinforcement all rolled into one. Solomon was essentially cementing the temple's role not just as a spiritual center, but as the heart of national life. The Feast of Tabernacles overlapping with the temple dedication created a rhythm of annual remembrance, teaching, and celebration that tied the people to God and to each other. And let's not forget the awe factor with numbers. Imagine explaining this to someone today. Tens of thousands of animals, 2 weeks of celebration, thousands of people involved, sacrifices, feasts, songs, prayers, worship, the whole kingdom converging on Jerusalem. It's almost cinematic, and the logistics alone are mind-boggling. Coordinating priests, offerings, food, lodging, security. It's insane. And here's the human touch. Despite all the grandeur and planning, there's joy, spontaneity, laughter, awe, and heartfelt worship. People weren't just spectators, they were participants in history, living through the culmination of God's promise in a very real way. And this feast is also symbolic. The sacrifices and the communal meals weren't just about material abundance. They symbolized obedience, provision, and God's generosity. It's a reminder that worship in Israel wasn't just private, it was public, communal, and deeply integrated into daily life. The temple, the sacrifices, the feast, they all reinforce the idea that God is at the center of everything: life, community, leadership, and national identity. And again, tying it back to the Feast of Tabernacles adds layers of meaning. It's about remembrance, gratitude, provision, and divine presence. The temple wasn't built in isolation. It was linked to Israel's spiritual rhythms, making the celebration more than a one-time event. It created continuity, teaching generations to come about God's faithfulness and the importance of communal worship and obedience. So, as you picture the scene, the grand feast, the overwhelming scale of sacrifices, the joyous crowd, the temple gleaming in the background, priests and officials managing the rituals, and everyone celebrating God's provision, you begin to understand why this event was so transformative. It wasn't just about wealth, architecture, or power. It was about worship, community, family, identity, and aligning the nation's heart with God's presence. And that's the significance of this moment. The temple completed, the nation celebrating, the Feast of Tabernacles woven into the dedication. It was awe-inspiring, deeply spiritual, and a permanent mark of God's faithfulness and Solomon's obedience. The people were joyful, full of heart, and for the first time, Israel had a central, permanent place to encounter God in a tangible, communal way, all tied to both divine promise and human participation. So, wrapping this up, Solomon's story is a powerful reminder about integrity and uprightness of heart. Small compromises might seem harmless at first, but they can open the door to much bigger problems over time. His journey shows us the importance of staying vigilant, humble, and dependent on God, even when life is full of success and blessings. Take a moment to reflect. Are there little cracks in your own life to address? If this story resonates, consider liking or subscribing to stay connected for more reflections like this.